Preservation lock locks a retention policy or a retention label policy. Once you enable preservation lock on a policy, no one, even a global administrator, would be able to turn off the policy, delete the policy, or make it less restrictive. In this video, I'm going to show you how to enable a preservation lock on a retention policy. Let's create a retention policy first. Enter the name for your retention policy. Click Next. Accept the defaults in the next screen and select Static for the locations. Disable Exchange, OneDrive, and Microsoft Groups, and we are going to be using SharePoint site for this example. Note that for the policy creation, you need to manually enter each site that you need to add to your locations. Select Custom Retention Period. I'm going to use 1 year. At the end of the retention period, I want to do nothing, so I make that selection and click Next. Now we have a Review and Finish screen, and click Submit, and our retention policy is successfully created. Let's take a look at the properties of this newly created policy. You can see that the very last property here is a preservation lock, and the value is set to no. Now we are going to lock this policy. We cannot do this via UI. We have to use a PowerShell. Make sure that you run PowerShell as administrator. Install module Exchange Online Management. Once the module installed, we're going to import it, and then we connect to the Compliance Center. Next, I'm using Get Retention Compliance Policy command, which will retrieve all retention policies from my demo tenant. I filtered the results using a restrictive retention property, which means that we want to see only retention policies for which preservation lock was enabled. As you can see, we didn't get any results. There are currently no retention policies with preservation lock in my demo tenant. To enable preservation lock on the policy, you need to use Set Retention Compliance Policy command. We provide policy name, preservation lock test, and set restrictive retention property to true. If we run the Get Retention Compliance Policy command again, it will now return us the restrictive retention policy. And this is how you set preservation lock on the retention policy. Now let's refresh our screen and then go to the properties of the preservation lock test policy and see what changed. And you can now see that the preservation lock is set to yes. You can no longer modify that value. It will stay there until the retention period is ended. You can only modify this policy if modifications makes it more restrictive. Let's see this in action. I'm going to attempt to modify this policy, and I'm going to modify the retention period of 1 year to maybe 6 months or 1 month even, and we click Next, and seemingly it is working, right? But when we submit the retention policy, you are going to receive an error message. And here it is. You cannot shorten the time frame to preserve the content because this is a restrictive policy. Additionally, if you applied the policy to locations, for instance SharePoint or Exchange Online, you cannot remove the locations from the policy once the policy is locked. My test policy had only SharePoint locations selected, but I can demonstrate you what happens if you try to select additional locations when I modify this policy. As I'm trying to add the Exchange Online location, I'm getting a warning that says that because this policy has preservation lock turned on, you won't be able to remove the users once they are added. You'll see the same warning if you try to add OneDrive accounts or M365 group mailboxes or sites. What happens if you log a policy by mistake? You can contact Microsoft to remove preservation log from the policy by opening a ticket and providing justification for your removal request. But if Microsoft is not willing to remove the log, there is nothing you can do aside from waiting for the policy to expire.